just over 10 years ago, I was a brand new assistant professor at Duke, and I remember sitting at my dining room table in the morning, drinking coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal, back when I still read the Wall Street Journal before Rupert Murdoch took it over. And I read this article about Lilly Pharmaceuticals throwing failure parties to celebrate science that was well conceived and well executed, but that for whatever reason just didn't result in a pharmaceutical product that could be brought to market. And as somebody who studies innovation in governance and trying to bring evidence-based policy to governance, I thought this was fascinating. Although I'm sure to those of you in the room who live here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, you're well aware that risk is inherently a part of innovation and that you have to be willing to fail in order to move forward. But as you might imagine, in Washington, D.C. or in Brussels, in government circles, failure is often about fault, and it's to be avoided at basically all costs. So you could imagine the headlines if instead of Lilly Pharmaceuticals, it was EPA. US EPA wastes millions of taxpayer dollars on unproven experiments. I thought this was interesting and probably didn't have any future, and I went back to my research, which is what all good junior faculty members do, designing randomized controlled trials and survey instruments and evaluations of government policies. And just as the haze of the pre-tenure life was lifting, the real world brought me back to these important questions about how do we design institutions in government that can actually learn from failure. And what were those major events? Of course, in 2010, we had the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We had the Fukushima nuclear accident after the tsunami in Japan. We had the 2008 financial crisis that affected the entire global economy. So during that time period, sort of brought about by those major events, I was fortunate enough to start working with a research team at Duke consisting of 2 law professors, Jonathan Weiner and Kim Kravick, and a history professor, Ed Ballison, as part of this Rethinking Regulation working group. And we started a book project that was going to look at under what circumstances are government responses to disasters productive and result in positive change and less likely occurrence of those disasters in the future, and under what circumstances are they basically knee-jerk reactions or symbolic reactions that may actually make things worse, and what can we learn and generalize from government responses to disasters. And as we were focused on this book project, we recognized that there, in fact, was an institution in government that was widely regarded as enormously successful at learning from failures, and whose reputation was positive amongst the public, amongst Congress, amongst the executive, right? An organization that could show up at the scene of a disaster and say, we're from the government and we're here to help, and it's not a bad joke. And that organization is the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB. And if you've heard of it before, it's probably because they investigate all airline crashes in the United States or that involve US-made equipment. And so when a Delta airline plane skids off the runway at LaGuardia in a snowstorm, it's the NTSB that shows up to figure out what went wrong and how we could prevent that from going wrong in the future. But what you may not know is they actually investigate a wide range of transportation accidents. So when a train goes off the rails carrying crude oil from the Bakken region in North Dakota and explodes, the NTSB is on the scene. If a pipeline leaks, the NTSB is on the scene. All of that is in their jurisdiction. And regardless of which area of transportation they work on, they are widely regarded as being successful at identifying problems, making recommendations that are recommendations both to the government for improvements and to industry for improvements, and seeing those recommendations through. So this sounds great, right? This is our solution. We'll just have everything be NTSB-like. In fact, during the 2010-2011 period, it wasn't uncommon at academic conferences to hear everybody say, we just need an NTSB-like agency for healthcare. We need an NTSB-like agency for finance. We need an NTSB-like agency for you name it. But there's a problem with that. And that is that it turns out there's another agency in the US government that was designed in a similar way as the NTSB, actually used a very similar charter modeled after the NTSB, but does not share the NTSB's reputation as being highly successful. And that agency is the Chemical Safety Board, or the CSB. And the Chemical Safety Board's mission is to go in after any accident at a chemical manufacturing plant, but much more broadly in any industrial manufacturing plant, and determine, again, what went wrong and what recommendations they could make to ensure worker and industrial safety in the future, right? So when the West Texas fertilizer plant blew up, it was the Chemical Safety Board's job to go in and figure out what went wrong. But unfortunately, unlike the NTSB, the entire history of the CSB has been mired in controversy that has really prevented it from being able to be successful. And they have been called to the Hill multiple times to testify before Congress on issues of mismanagement, whistleblower retaliation. They've lost many of their senior investigators. Their reports take 4 or 5 years from the time of the accident to come out, so nobody thinks they're that useful anymore. And just 2 weeks ago, Chairman Dr. Morio Arasso, who is the former chairman of the CSB, was asked to resign by the Obama administration 3 months before the end of his term. So how can this be, right? How can you have an organization that was modeled after the NTSB, was designed to exactly replicate this successful agency that figures out what's wrong and makes things better, and then have it just completely not work? So our research suggests that there are several critical features of success for the NTSB that we need to keep in mind as we move forward. The first, of course, is that independence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Both the CSB and the NTSB are independent, but they have vastly different levels of success that depend on some of these other features, including the nature of the industry. So when a Delta airline plane skids off the runway at LaGuardia, it doesn't just make people fearful of flying Delta, right? It makes people fearful of flying. And so that common sense of fate that the airline industry has is something that has been cultivated over time, and that really impacts the way in which NTSB relates with the industry and the way in which NTSB has an impact both on the industry and on the regulators of that industry. Because now everybody sort of feels like we're in it together, and if we can learn something from what happened to Delta, it can make all of us safer and improve all of our bottom lines. Right? The same, unfortunately, is not true in chemical and industrial manufacturing. So when the fertilizer plant blows up in West Texas, a sugar plant may not think that they have anything to learn from that, even though they actually do. The third thing has to do with leadership, and this is something that I found really fascinating as someone who has spent her entire career studying public policy and economics and governance, is that one of the reasons that the NTSB is so widely successful is that it's actually led by engineers. Not people with degrees in public policy, but people with degrees in engineering. And the ethos of engineering is really about what went wrong and how do we fix it, right? And so the NTSB has gone out of its way. They make recommendations, but they don't make specific policy recommendations. And they don't get into the business of making policy. They leave that to the Department of Transportation or the FAA or other places that actually regulate the industry. And the CSB, unfortunately, has not been able to do that. They've largely drawn their leaders from areas of public health, or worker safety, often associated pretty heavily with the unions. And so they haven't been able to establish, even though they're technically independent, they haven't been able to establish that sense of independence from either the regulators or from the industry to allow them to really be these objective third-party evaluators. One of the things that then affects is their ability to follow through on their recommendations. So because the CSB has been trying to promote specific policies as opposed to broad recommendations, they have a very difficult time then working with the regulators to follow through. And that's something that the NTSB hasn't suffered from, largely, again, because of this problem-focused ethos. So what I think we should take away from all of this is, when we're investigating disasters or we're thinking about learning from failure, if the focus is on blame, then nobody wins. The focus has to be on assessing what went wrong and how we can make the world better, all of us in it together. And only then can we actually move the world forward. Look, I grew up at a time, like probably many of you, where I actually believed that the government could make a real difference in people's lives. And today, the most loathed profession in America is not tax auditor for the IRS, but US congressperson. And I think that only through bringing these kinds of evidence-based approaches to government and thinking carefully about how we can learn from failure and make government better, can we actually return to a time where government can make a real positive difference in people's lives. Thank you.